Hello, my name is Ban Chimer. I am the founder of Inyalinya Basiddet organization. Inyalinya Basiddet, it's feminist and a feminist organization focusing on domestic worker in Lebanon. Because of the coronavirus and the lockdown, many domestic workers are suffering behind closed door, and they can't even feed their kids. Because of that, we are gathering food and distributing home to home. But we want to do more, and we set up also GoFundMe accounts. If anyone is interested to donate, we'll be grateful. And you can find this link to in our Twitter at Inyalinya DWU. Thank you so much.
So this is a conversation with Chuck Derry. He's the co-founder of the Gender Violence Institute and the Minnesota Men's Action Network, Alliance to Prevent Sexual and Domestic Violence. I wanted to talk to him after reading his very interesting essay, Psychologizing Oppression, in which he argues against the belief that men who are violent are quote-unquote losing control or about to quote-unquote explode. He instead argues that men who are violent do so because it is beneficial to them, and thus argues that this is what society should instead be tackling and facing. In some ways, this is an episode addressing men, especially cis men who benefit from patriarchal structures even if they're often unaware of it. It is an exploration of the privileges that come with simply being a cis man in society, and especially a cis straight man, and how even men who consider themselves allies, the so-called good guys, need to also question why so many of us do not actively work to end gender-based violence, structural inequalities, and patriarchal oppression more broadly. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
My name is Chuck Derry. I'm from the Gender Violence Institute in Clearwater, Minnesota, United States. And I started doing this work in 1983. I got hired to work at a radical feminist women's advocacy program who was working to get the criminal justice system in 1983 to do something about men's violence against women, to actually arrest men and hold them accountable, because that was not happening. And I was hired to work with men who batter. So men who were arrested, then part of what they'd have 90 days hanging over their head of jail time, and also would have to go to a 24-week batterers program, which I coordinated. And it was really amazing when I started doing this work, and because I started doing it, I was 27 years old. And I thought I was pretty cool. You know, I didn't think I was very sexist or racist or anything. And then I started working in this radical feminist women's program and found out, geez, it wasn't just these attitudes I had. It was like my big toe was sexist, right? It was like a part of it's in my bones. And so I was really lucky to work with women who were willing to challenge me about my sexism. So while they're challenging systemic sexist oppression with the criminal justice system, which was a quote unquote good old boys club at the time, and largely still is, but really challenging male dominance roles, criminal justice system, and lack of accountability for men's violence. So we were doing that work at the same time. They were willing to challenge me about my own sexism, and they're willing to debate with me, and they're also willing to get angry with me, which was really very kind of them and helpful. Rather than just blow me off, they actually got angry with me at times. And so I was very lucky. As a 27-year-old male, I thought doing this work, I thought, oh, this will be really interesting for me in my life. But I had no idea it was totally radicalized my life. That was in 1983 I started. So I've been doing it since 1983, 37 years, and did a lot of work with men for about 10 years in the criminal justice system. And then I've been doing training and technical assistance and presentations nationally and internationally since that time, working at the criminal justice system and also engaging men and how to engage men. So I was co-founder of Men Engage North America, part of the Men Engage Alliance board for 5 years. Also created the Minnesota Men's Action Network Alliance to prevent sexual and domestic violence in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, and been doing a lot of coordination since the 80s of engaging men to end men's violence and other forms of sexist oppression.
Mm. I found out about you and Men Engage and the Gender Violence Institute because you wrote this essay called Psychologizing Oppression. Can you, for those who, I will link it in the show notes in any case, but can you kind of just give a bit of a picture of what the essay is about and why did you feel the need to write it in the first place?
Well, I'm noticing globally, and this is something that came up in the 80s when we started doing this work with Men Who Batter, that there's a notion that men who batter kind of lose control of themselves, or they don't know how to appropriately deal with their feelings because men are supposed to not have feelings, right? Only anger, and that's okay. And what has happened is that this was happening in the 80s and it kind of went away, but then in the last 15, especially the last 5 years, I'm seeing it more and more where people want to continue to psychologize men's use of violence against women, saying it's either because they're traumatized as children or they don't know how to deal with their feelings effectively. And what it does is absolutely ignore male privilege and entitlement. And it ignores the massive benefits that men who batter get from that violence. And I can go in some detail with that later if you like. So the primary thing that happens is that men who batter will routinely want to say they lost control of themselves because then they're not really responsible. And actually, first what they will do is they'll try to blame the victim. She did this, she did that. Look how she is with the kid. She's a drunk. She's a, et cetera, et cetera. If that doesn't work with these helping professionals and neighbors and police, then what they'll do is they'll go into, well, I just lost it. I don't know what happened. I just lost it. Or I was drunk. I couldn't control myself. And people will buy that. And what's really nice for men who batter when they buy that is that they are not held accountable for their crime because they just lost control. They really didn't have control over themselves. So subsequently, the professional responses to those men is inadequate because that's false. Men are very much in control of their behavior. They're very sophisticated in using violence and other methods of abuse to control their wives and partners and the children. And it's really astounding. The power and control wheel that was developed out of Duluth, Minnesota in the early 80s really was developed by talking to battered women and what was their experience of being battered. And what happened through multiple kinds of focus groups with battered women is they came to a further understanding that this violence was functional and that it was purposeful and that it wasn't just the physical and sexual assault, it was also the isolation, the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse, the manipulating the children against the mother to control the mother, hurting the children to control the mother and the children, economic control. It was a whole system of control, a system of power and control. That's why they call it the power and control wheel. And this wheel was developed in Duluth, Minnesota in like 1982, 83. And it was translated into 60 different languages and spread across the globe in over 120 countries, and then they stopped counting. And so what's very interesting to me, and I've worked internationally in different countries, in Taiwan and Moldova and Finland and other places, and it's amazing because women in Taiwan can look at the power and control wheel that was developed by women in northern Minnesota in the US, and they can look at it and say, yeah, that's right. That's what's happening to me. Women in Japan, women in Brazil, women in Sweden, right? All over the world. So we have this male cultural norm of dominance and power and control and violence that's global. And women throughout the globe identify this. And I've never had any problem talking to men, even if I'm talking through a translator internationally, and us being able to understand and connect around our beliefs and our actions that we take towards women. And so so the psychologizing of oppression is suggesting it's a psychological issue ignores the benefits and the male entitlement that fuels this oppression. And it's very disconcerting that it's happening as we talk about men's violence and oppression of women, that we want to medicalize, psychologize that problem and totally ignore that is a very conscious decision that they're making for distinct reasons. And the benefits are enormous.
Obviously, I mean, I grew up in Lebanon, but the notion of men losing control is such a, as you said, it's such a global thing that I immediately understood what you were talking about. And you mentioned in our pre-chat, you mentioned this as well, that when you were working with men who batter, and they would say stuff along the lines of, you know, I lost control and I lost control, you would then ask them, like, who did, like, lost control of who? Like, who did you actually lose control of? Which kind of, can you talk a bit about that process? You mentioned before, we can go a bit into details. Let's do that now.
Well, it is the thing, when men would come into my group in the early 80s and they'd say I lost control. One of the first things I would ask them is, have you ever killed your wife? And they were just shocked that I would ask that question and say, of course not. I say, oh, okay, so you're kind of choosing to what degree you're going to abuse her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And then I'd ask them, so have you ever beat your wife in church or the synagogue or the temple or sweat lodge? No, of course not. Oh, I see. Okay, so you're actually, how about the grocery store? Have you ever smacked her in the grocery store or out on the mall? Well, of course not. Okay, so you're actually choosing where you're going to be violent. Oh, and a lot of times their response was just silence, right?
Mm.
So I would routinely, it was one of the first things to let them know that we're not buying this fact that you're out of control, because you're making choices. Even when you're drunk, you're making choices. And we have many alcoholic men in our groups who would say, yeah, I still knew what I was doing when I was drunk.
Mm-hmm.
But if he can get drunk, this is a great tactic that they use too, to avoid accountability, because what they can say is that she did this or she said that and it really bothered me. I went to the bar and got drunk. So it's really her fault I got drunk. And then I came home and I beat her. And it was because I was drunk, right? I didn't have any control. Meanwhile, you ask them, well, let me ask you, did you by any chance ever take a swing at the 6'5", 250-pound bouncer who's kind of got you around the neck and, just escorting you out the door of the bar? They say, no. Okay. So they're not taking a swing at that 6'5", 250-pound bouncer. They're going home and taking a swing at their 5'4", 140-pound wife.
Mm.
So regardless of how drunk they are, they're still making decisions. And I think this is really critical in our abilities to, one, hold them accountable, and also to give them the opportunity to change their mind. But here's the problem. There are so many benefits. When I first started to understand this more clearly after seeing the power and control wheel and understanding there were conscious decisions, I asked the guys one time in group, so what are the benefits of your violence? And they kind of all looked at each other, which was notable,
Mm-hmm.
right? Should we admit this, guys? They all looked at each other and they said, there are no benefits. And I said, well, you must be getting something out of it. Otherwise, why would you do it? And they kind of looked at each other again. And then one guy started naming the benefits. And then they all started chiming in on the benefits. And we filled a 4-foot by 8-foot blackboard at the time and ran out of space. I was writing on the blackboard all the benefits and we ran out of space. And I'm looking at this, I'm saying, oh my God, why would you stop? I thought, okay, I'm going to ask him. So I asked him, well, why would you stop? And then we filled like a 2-foot by 2-foot space on the board. Got arrested, civil protection orders against me. My adult children aren't asking me to their weddings. This is my 3rd divorce, and I got to come to groups like this. That was it. And it was one of the first times I knew this before, but this really embedded in me how important a strong and consistent criminal justice system response was to men's violence against women. Because if you look at the cost benefit analysis, there are so many benefits and so few costs for the violence that and all the controlling abusive methods they're using. There's so few negative consequences and so many positive consequences. And I've actually created a handout that I've sent out to different folks judges and others that really identified, no, this is why men batter, because it's functional and it works.
What were some of the stuff that, when you asked them to list the benefits, what were some of the stuff they were listing?
So I get my way. She's
Uh-huh.
scared, won't go out and spend money. Respect, she won't argue with me. The feeling that I'm superior, she's accountable to me in terms of what she does, where she goes, who she sees. I get to make all the decisions. I have total control. I get sex with who I want to, when I want to, how I want to. I get all the money. I get all the money. I mean, she's working, maybe I'm not even working, or maybe we're both working, but it doesn't matter. I get to control all the money. I mean, just that alone. No negotiation. He doesn't have to do any housework. He doesn't have to deal with the kids. He can, in fact, control the kids the way he wants. He gets to convince her that she's nuts. It's her fault. He's the king of the castle. She's a robot, quote unquote, robot babysitter, maid, sex, food. I had one guy say two really good examples. I thought a friend of mine was doing a group, and they were talking about male privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And this one guy in group said, "Well, let me ask you something. So when I come home from work, I've got this chair. It's my chair. It's a recliner in the living room. And when I come home from work, I sit in my chair. And even if the kids are watching TV, doesn't matter. I change the channel to whatever I want to watch. And then if I want a beer, I ask for a beer. Beer comes to my chair. If I want a coffee, coffee comes to my chair. Even dinner. If I don't want to get up for dinner, dinner comes to my chair. I mean, I don't even have to leave my chair. If I want a magazine or a newspaper, it comes to my chair. Are you asking us to give up our chairs?" She said, "Yeah, exactly." I had another guy when I was doing this, what are the benefits? One guy said that they get to dictate reality. And this was a guy who hadn't said much in group, and he kind of looked like he couldn't really even walk and chew gum at the same time, right? This is my bias, right? But he said, "I get to dictate reality." And I'm going, wow, okay, well, tell me more about that. And he said he was walking down the street one time with his wife, and this really good looking woman was across the street walking, and he was staring at her, right? And his wife says, "Don, I really don't like it when you stare at other women when you're with me." He said, "What?" She said, "I don't like it when you're staring at other women when you're with me." "What do you mean? I'm not staring at." He said, "Yes, you are." And he said he turned to her and he gave her his look, which a lot of guys talk about. All they have to do is give them a look, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that easy. Once you beat them, they know. So he says, "I turned to her and I gave her a look." I said, "No, I wasn't." And she didn't say anything. And what he said is he knew that in her mind, she didn't go into her mind, "Oh, that creep, he's such a creep, he's such a jerk, what is wrong?" That's not where she went. In her mind, she went, "Oh, I must just be, I'm just so jealous. There must be something wrong with me. I'm just so jealous all the time. Why am I always doing this?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
So this guy knew that his violence gave him the ability to dictate her reality. And that would allow him to continue to do these things, right? Because if she didn't abide by his notion and his assertion of what was going on, she was going to get hurt, and her children were going to get hurt. And so the first time this happened to me, it just blew me away. And at that time we were doing life skills stuff, teaching them assertiveness, teaching them how to access their feelings. And I tell guys to go home and do assertiveness practice. I feel when you, because, right, with your wife, very 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 accountable and conscientious. And the guys would come back the next week and say, I'd say, "Well, how'd it go?" And they said, "It didn't work." I said, "What do you mean?" "The assertiveness didn't work." I said, "Well, how come?" "Because I wanted her to do A, B, and C, but she wanted to do D, E, and F, and she wouldn't do A, B, and C. So it didn't work." So then I realized that, oh my gosh, what I'm doing is I'm actually giving these guys tools, more tools, so they can be more sophisticated in their battering. They were using what I was teaching them in class to go home and use those tactics to further control her. And really, it all came down to she wasn't giving me what I wanted. So this didn't work. Assertiveness didn't work because I still didn't get what I wanted. And so when I understood the benefits and I understood how this this life skills and the psychological kinds of methods of dealing with men was not effective, then we began to shift the group dramatically. And we started looking at their belief systems. What are their individual belief systems about women and about men's rights over women and dominance and superiority to women? And what are the social constructs, the social norms that support all that we live with every day? And what was the intent of their abuse? And what was the impact of their abuse? We have a power and control log. We'd have men log their behaviors, different types of behaviors of abusive, physical, sexual, and emotional, psychological, economical, male privilege, etc. We'd have them log them, and it was so instructive that what their intents were always fit their impacts. Because we'd say, what was your beliefs? What's your intents? What was the impact on you, on her, on the children? And the intents always fit the impact on her and on him. He got what he wanted. The impacts were very negative for her, but he got what he wanted. And so it's very critical that we do not pretend that men are being violent and abusive and harassing and sexually assaulting and dominating women in our culture because they just don't know any better. They could not be this sophisticated if they did not know any better. If they're out of control. We had, people talk about anger management. And somebody told a good story about, the guy was with his wife and they had ordered a pizza to be delivered to their apartment. Mm-hmm. And they called up and ordered the pizza. And then before the pizza came, they got into an argument and he started just getting wild. He started just getting quote unquote crazy. He started throwing things, breaking things. He was throwing her up against the wall. He was slapping her. He was throwing her on the ground. And all of a sudden the doorbell rang. It was the pizza guy. And he stopped everything. He walked over to the door. He opened the door. Hi, how's it going? Oh, pretty good. How you doing? Oh, really good. Thanks a lot. And gave him an extra $5 tip. Hey, thanks a lot, man. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, bye. Closed the door. And then went back to his behavior with his wife. That's anger management. Mm-hmm. Right? He's deciding it ain't about his anger. It's about his intimidation and his violence. And he's making decisions all the time. And sometimes guys are making decisions 2 weeks ago. She said something, and in his brain, he's going, if she ever says that again, that's it. I'm going to smack her. 2 weeks later, she says the same thing. It's a viable concern, right, in the relationship, and he smacks her. And he doesn't have to think about it because he already decided 2 weeks ago. So it's just a way that when we psychologize oppression like this, what we do is we help the oppressor, not the oppressed, because he gets escape responsibility. If we say this because he was beaten as a child, there's this thing that says hurt people. Well, the reality is predominantly hurt people help people. I worked with so many men who were one of 4 brothers, and he was the only one who battered. They all grew up in a family where the father was very abusive to the mother and to the children. And 3 out of the 4 boys said, I will never, ever, ever do that to somebody else. Mm-hmm. Never. I will never touch my wife or my girlfriend, because they lived through the pain. They were under the beds holding their little sisters, or their big sister was holding them in the closet as they're hearing the mother scream and their dad slam her up against the wall. So they lived through that pain, and they said they would never. In fact, I've worked a lot with law enforcement and therapists and ministers, and a lot of the people that are helping professionals did grow up in violent homes, and they became professionals to help others. And so that does not cause, being abused as a child does not cause you to be violent. I mean, if this was true, how many women and girls are sexually assaulted before they're 18 and beaten? And we don't see them out on the street sexually assaulting men. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is a gendered thing. It's about dominance. And we get massive benefits from it. Not just guys who batter, but we all benefit from it. Which makes you wonder if that has anything to do with so much male silence around this. Or when men do speak, that provides this kind of psychologizing excuse. Either it's something about her, it's a relationship issue, or that he just doesn't know any better, or he was abused as a child. It all provides excuses and ignores our history, our global history of oppression, which is motivated by self-interest, by greed, and accomplished through cruelty. This is normal behavior. We used to, I'll just say this and I'll stop. When we first started doing the program, we thought maybe it was a psychological issue in 1983. And for the first year, we did psychological evaluations for every person, every man who came into our group. And what happened is those men reflected, their psychological testing just reflected the general population. The same levels of any psychological problems and no problems was parallel to the general population. So that's when we realized, no, okay, this is not a psychological issue. This is a social construct. This is a social norm. 1 in 3 women beaten, 1 in 3 women raped. This is normal male behavior. And so how do we change those norms?
I mentioned in our pre-chat that part of the reason I wanted to do this episode is to, like, one of the underlying themes, if you want, of the podcast is that the local is global, but at the same time the personal is political, and by which I mean what we do actually does affect the world around us, and even if what we do is nothing, that is also a form of, that is also an action. And I just remember feeling even a bit anxious about, let's say we record this, and what I'm planning on doing after this is, well, edit and, publish it and everything, and then send it to my guy friends. Now, my friends are, I can safely say, are people who, if you ask them, do you consider yourself a feminist, they will all say yes. And they would go to the feminist march, which I will talk about in a bit, because it was one of my aha moments as well. And they would, be on the books, progressive, supporting, everything, let's say. But it's very difficult usually to take the conversation to the next level. It's difficult. What are some of the assumptions that you have as to what your partner, or even like your theoretical partner? So, like, if one day you do have a partner, what are some of the things that would be normal for you to do in the house? What are some of the things that would be normal, in quotation, of course, normal for you to do in the house, or normal for her to do in the house? What are some of the obligations that you would have towards the children, let's say, in the future, or etc., etc.? And those are conversations that are always difficult to have. Maybe, and you might, because you obviously have way more experience than me on this front. Maybe it seems that this is changing slowly in the past few years, but again, emphasis on slowly. And why is it that slow? Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, it's still benefiting a lot of people. In this case, men. It's benefiting a lot of men. It's benefiting all men, for that matter, to live in a society where this is the norm. Even if me personally, I am not physically violent or psychologically violent, etc., etc., or so I think anyway, I would still be living in the society that benefits me, because I'm a cis straight male. And what really caught my attention in the essay, as I was mentioning before, is the losing control, and even the term anger management, and even the term toxic masculinity. Those are terms that I'm sure can have their uses, but if you ask the follow-up question, like, losing control of who, toxic to whom, what's the other one? Anger management. I mean, if you're managing anger, you're not actually solving it. Can I wanted to ask you about these quote unquote nice guys. So I'm putting them in quotation, of course. The guys that feel that they're not benefiting from this because they don't actively participate in this, or so they think anyway. They're not stalking, let's say, a woman. They're not being violent. They're not yelling or using even derogatory term, etc., etc. They're not doing all of those visibly bad things, let's say. What? How have you, let's say, managed when you talk to other guys, or whether in your work, or maybe in private lives even, I don't know. How have you been? How have you tried, let's say, to tell the quote unquote nice guys that they are also part of the problem?
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I first started doing the batters groups, I thought to myself, oh, this would be really interesting. It would be interesting to see how these guys are different from me,
Mm.
right? Because I never abused women. And that's not what was interesting at all. What was interesting is how much I was like men who beat and rape women, not how much I was different from them. That's what was interesting. I mean, I remember one group, and I was co-facilitating with a female facilitator, and a guy told a sexist joke, and we all laughed, all of us, including me.
Mm.
And the female facilitator says, "Let's just back up a little bit on this joke. Let's go." And I thought to myself, "Oh, dang God, I just blew it." Right?
Mm.
So the thing that was really clear to me early on is this is not an us them issue. It's not I'm a good guy and they're the bad guys. This is a we issue. That many men could not be beating that many women and children throughout the world. 1 in 3 and higher in some places. 1 in 3 women live with that risk and the reality of being beaten. 1 in 3 by a man she knows. 1 in 3 live with the risk and reality of being sexually assaulted, mostly by men they know. They could not that many men could not be beating and raping that many women without widespread cultural support. And so where is that support? I mean, the worst thing I could be, and I'll get to your question
Take your time.
directly, but the worst thing I could be when I was 2.5, 3 feet tall, right? I'm 4, 5, 6 years old, was who half the population is.
Right.
Half the people in my classroom is a girl. Don't throw a ball like a girl. Don't run like a girl. Don't do anything like a girl. That's how I know I'm the right kind of boy. And I'm in first grade thinking about this. And I'm looking around and in my culture, I'm 6 years old, and men are running the whole show, especially white guys here in Minnesota and US at the time. And so it didn't take a 6-year-old rocket scientist to figure out that if the worst thing I could be is a girl, then boys must be better than girls. Duh. And what was interesting is one of the first things we started doing when we really realized this supremacy idea is we started imposing ourselves on girls' personal spaces. I was in a Catholic school and we had to wear uniforms. They had dresses down to their ankles and we had to wear ties. And at recess, we'd run up to the girls and grab their dresses and go, "Tuesday, dress up day." And we'd throw their dresses up in the air so we could see their underwear. And if they had polka dots or butterflies on their underwear, we'd roll around the ground laughing, and they're walking away. Leave me alone, right? And all my friends and I, we're in second grade, and we're laughing. Pretty soon, the girls started coming to school wearing culottes, which are shorts, underneath their dresses because of what we were doing. So it's very interesting. Again, as we considered us being better than girls, we started imposing ourselves on their personal space. And this got worse when we hit puberty. We were moving from boyhood to manhood. Worst insult I could get was somebody call me a pussy, a woman, or a femme. Those were fighting words. Some 6th grade boy come up to me, 12, 13-year-old boy, call me a pussy, a woman, or femme. He wanted to fight. And coaches were trying to motivate us by insulting us, by calling us girls. "Come on, ladies, pull your panties up. Come on, you're like an old woman," right? So it was just normalized. So woman hating became normalized. Whenever you have one group of people thinks they're better than another group of people, you have a tendon hostility. We see this with racism, we see this with homophobia, transphobia, we see this all over the place. And it's certainly part of sexist culture, that it is fun for guys to just kind of joke around with each other, making comments about women's bodies and what they like to do with it, or making sexist jokes as a way to bond with one another. And we're entertained by violence against women. Look at video games, look at TV, look at movies. There's all kinds of pornography. 90% of pornography now, global pornography, is violent against women. So we're now attaching men's most powerful pleasure centers in the body, hearts, and mind directly to women's pain. And it becomes so normalized, people don't even notice it. And so when I'm talking to men, a lot of times what I do is I'll use my own examples. So it's really clear this is not an us them issue, this is a we issue. And I'll use examples of things I've done before and how that has connected to the 1 in 3 women being raped, the 1 in 3 women being sexually assaulted, whether it's comments about their bodies and what they like to do with them, or just ignoring them when they're speaking at work. She says something, she's the expert, and the guy right next to her says the same thing, and all of a sudden he's got all the attention, right? Not her. And so part of what I had to identify, and part of what I do with men, is I put this in a we situation where I will use examples of myself, and then I'll talk about this concern. And then and this opens the door for my friends to share as well. Especially if you're talking about men who identify themselves as pro-feminist, then, you open this door and admit to things that you have done that are problematic and that you are doing that are problematic. And you ask them, do you ever do that? Did you guys do that? And they'll say, oh yeah, definitely. I know it. Isn't that something? And meanwhile, our sisters and our mothers and our colleagues and our friends have a 1 in 3 chance of being raped. And we're never making this connection. What are the terms we use when we're talking about women? When we're just guys are just hanging out and we're talking about women. And this is crude language, but I'll share it because it's very common in the US. And I know it has global connections as well, but they're called bitches and they're called whores and hoes and cunts and sluts, right? Guys are just hanging out, young men after a party, could be old guys after a party too. They say, yeah, they're talking about the party the night before. Yeah, did you see those bitches, man? They came up here. Yeah, this hoe comes up to me and says, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this bitch, blah, right? It's bitches and hoes, bitches and hoes and bitches and hoes, and no one making any connection to that language and 1 in 3 women being beaten and 1 in 3 women being raped. And that is exactly the same language that men who are beating, raping women are saying as they're beating and raping those women. And so I think bringing to the table, one of the primary things I think, if you're talking to men who care, the primary thing is to bring the violence to the table first, because many men have ignored this or don't know that 1 in 3, the high rates, 1 in 3, 1 in 2, women are sexually assaulted or abused. You bring that to the table first and you put all the cultural norms within the context. We know that all these norms support it. And I love what you said about nothing is an action as well. Mm-hmm. Silence supports violence. Mm-hmm. This many men could not be beating and raping this many women if all the other men who were not beating and raping women stood up and said no, period. We change the policies, we change protocols, we change laws, we do cultural norms, everything. We just say no, this isn't happening anymore. And the jokes, that's not funny. The waitress comes over, I just got done with a soccer game with my friends. I'm in my 30s and whatever, 20s, 30s, and I go to the bar and we get a beer. The waitress brings over the beer and she's walking away. One guy says to the other, ooh, I'd like to jump that. The other one says, get out of here. You wouldn't even know what to do with it, right? And you notice that language, jump that. If in the US, if I said I got jumped, I'm a white guy, I'm walking down the street, I got jumped, everyone knows that means I got mugged, I got attacked, mm-hmm. Right? So we're using this violent language, and this guy's talking about sex. And he doesn't say I like to jump her, he's saying I'd like to jump that. So she's a piece of meat, it's an object. Mm-hmm. And the other guy says, yeah, you wouldn't know what to do with it. So even if this is happening and the friends are bonding around this sexist, woman-hating comments, am I willing to say something? Sometimes guys think, no, I'm not going to laugh at that joke, and then the guy will know that I'm against sexist jokes. No, a guy does not think you're against sexist joke. That guy assumes that all men like sexist jokes. That's same thing as there are a lot of white people who just think all white people like a racist joke. He doesn't think you don't like sexist jokes. He just thinks you don't like that sexist joke. So your silence just continues to support this violence. And so you can individually, we have to, as men, look at the actions that we take and the actions we do not take, because they both have significant influence. There's no neutral place. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. There's no neutral place in there at all. So many men want to talk good and then sit back down in their comfort of privilege and do nothing because the other guys might not like them. Here's the other thing, and I'll end with this, but I'll stop with this. But if my friend's telling a sexist joke or telling some joke that's sexually objectifying this woman, and I challenge him about it, well, that means I can't tell those jokes anymore. Am I willing to give that up? Am I willing to give up that simple benefit of not telling sexist jokes? I mean, that came to mind for me when I first started doing this work and becoming more aware of the level of violence and my own sexism. And I remember friends making sexist jokes and me thinking, I don't know if I want to confront them, because if I confront them, heck, 2 weeks from now, if I want to tell a sexist joke, they're going to give me a hard time. So if I confront them, I won't be able to keep telling those sexist jokes. Am I willing to give that up? Right? Something so simple as that. Am I willing to give that up? And when I understood the connection between that behavior and 1 in 3 women being raped, yes, I was willing to give it up. But these things can be frustrating to give up these benefits too. But we have to decide, do we care? Do we care about women's lives? Do we care about justice? Because if we really care, then we will act.
I had a number of, I guess we can describe them as aha moments. I'll start with the most recent one because I think it's the most revealing one, and at the same time, yeah, it's just the most revealing one. Uh, since the recent uprising in Lebanon, the October one, there's been a number of feminist marches, and there was one big one that was organized by feminist activists and feminist groups. And the one of the triggers of that march, the reason why it happened, is that there was a well-known personality, let's say a guy, who was being accused by a number of women of sexual harassment and of rape, and he was kind of given a sort of media platform as well. He got some kind of media spotlight, and so he was sort of mentioned in the chants, and there were the chants were kind of general supportive chants, like for example. A common one would be against patriarchy, and then people would reply revolution, and then etc. etc. Against sexism, against homophobia, etc. etc. And at some point, it's a feminist march. I would say roughly maybe 80% of the people there were women, and then roughly 20% were men. Very young on average, I would say like early 20s. And at some point, while in the march, one of the chants that I start hearing is something along the lines of "We know rapists are among us," or "We know harassers are among us." I think is a literal translation. And I just remember sort of reflecting on that, like on the spot. I had maybe like three different thoughts at the same time. And the first thought was, even here, I thought probably like the guys around here, maybe these are the guys that have repented. Maybe these are the guys that have, fixed their quote unquote their problems. They're not the bad guys, they're the good guys. So that was an aha moment, because obviously then I rationalized it fairly quickly by then. This was literally like, we're talking about 6 months ago or something. And I just, obviously, I reasoned with myself, so to speak. All of this was happening in my mind. And I was like, well, obviously, if we're talking about, as you said, 1 in 3, and we're talking about these very, very significant percentages of this happening, this has to also happen with people that are quote unquote the good guys. And again, obviously, all this in quotes. The other aha moment, and this was about a decade ago, something like that. I was sitting with one of my friends, and she was telling me her story at some point. And at some point, I don't remember the details, but at some point, she told me what happened to her some years before. And she was sexually harassed by a guy who was hired to be her driver at some point. And I just remember taking that in and being very moved. By then I was already calling myself an activist, so I saw this through the lens of social justice, right? Like, this is a bad thing that happened. And at some point later on, or I don't remember the timeline exactly, but I just remember hearing more and more of these exact same stories from my other close friends who are women. And it just, there was this aha moment at some point when I realized, well, that's all of them. Every single one of them has told me that something has happened to them. It ranged from everything from being stalked to sexually harassed to raped to beaten, to every single one of them, with almost no exceptions, was telling me that this has happened to them. This is still happening to them. They still, one of my friends in this, I will squeeze that in a sense, in as in another aha moment, but it's related to this. She told me that at some point for like a whole year, she whenever she would go back home, she would put something in front of the door to make sure that the door cannot be opened. And I asked why. Like, were you actually being followed by someone? Like, did you have quote unquote a concrete reason? And she told me, yeah, there was a guy who kept on following me for a very long time. He wouldn't give up. I confronted him once, and I could only do that because it was in broad daylight, etc., etc. And then he disappeared for some time, and then he would pop up again. But basically, he was always in the back of her mind. And so she told me, like, do you know what that's like? And obviously, I said, no, I don't. in Lebanon, I walk and I'm as normative as it gets. I'm a middle class, cis, straight guy. I walk, and as far as I could remember, I almost never felt threatened in most streets, in most times, even in Lebanon, in Beirut especially. And the third aha moment is one that I had way too late because it related to how where I grew up. I grew up in a household of women. I grew up with my mom and my sister. There were no guys in the apartment in the house, and so I was the guy of the house, as traditional norms would have them, and by which I mean, of course, patriarchal and sexist norms. And when I started linking these two, and when I started having more friends, I didn't have many friends growing up, but when I started having more friends, and these friends were women, and they started telling me these stories, it's like, wait, so even my mom and my sister, if we're talking about statistically speaking, maybe my grandmother, maybe, and I just remember that feeling, that realization, if you want, coming all down on me at the same time. That's probably not how it happened on the spot, but that's how I remember it now. It's kind of like this light bulb moment. But the problem, and this is something that you highlight, and I'll ask you to comment on some of these aha moments, whether on in your life maybe, or maybe in some of those guys that you were talking to. It doesn't matter if I had the aha moment. What matters if, like, what am I actually going to do with that aha moment? I can rational, I can I can say, well, I have found enlightenment here. I am no longer sexist. I am devoid of sexism. Well, then what? There's still something that needs to be done now.
I really love the point that you're actually listening to women. You're listening to them, and when they know you're listening, and you're not saying yeah, but what were you wearing? What was she doing? She shouldn't have been drunk. You're
Mm-hmm.
actually listening and absorbing. Then more women are going to talk to you and share that information. I was blown away too when I started doing this work, and all the women I knew in my family and friends who have been sexually assaulted in their lives and beaten in their lives. It's incredible. And that really challenges me personally. How am I going to be a part of the problem or part of the solution? Just like you're saying, you have aha moments, and then what do you do with it? Am I willing to give up porn? I mean, that was a big question for me. That was before video games, much less online. That was just magazines I used occasionally. Was I
Mm-hmm.
willing to give that up because I knew, oh, the majority of the women in pornography are not there because they want to be. There's a gun at their head off camera. Am I willing to get off to actually what this is rape? Am I willing to stop sexually objectifying women? And what would happen after I stopped using porn? I stopped using porn for 3 months just to see what it would do in my head, and totally shifted how I was thinking about women and viewing women who were riding their bike down the road, and how I looked at them, what I thought about my friends, colleagues, workers, all kinds of folks. And so I think the fact that you listen to women and then care, and then the caring is manifested by our action. And so I really like what you're saying about this action. It's a lot of times people talk about toxic masculinity, right? And it's the guys. You got to convince the guys that sexism's not good for them, and they're stuck in the man box. And the man box, if you step out of the man box, you get slapped back in the man box. I got news for you. The reason men are in the man box isn't because of being slapped by guys or you step out. It's because of all the goodies in that man box.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of goodies, and this is just one great example, right? That we don't even notice. And why would we want to stop that? Why would we want to give that up? God, that's great. I make one or two dishes and I get high praise. The bar is very low for men.
Yeah.
For pro-feminist ally men, I mean, all you have to do is, show up at a march once a year, and you're a
Exactly.
hero. You're a hero. The bar is about 2 inches off the ground. It's time to raise the bar. And one of the things that we did when we did the Minnesota Men's Action Network is really what we're doing is, a lot of times people think prevention, how do you shift these social norms, is about awareness and education. But we know historically throughout the globe that awareness and education alone does not shift social norms that support oppression and other levels of unhealthy behaviors, and like smoking or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we use is this called the spectrum of prevention. And what it identifies is that you actually use awareness and community education to create the social capital and the political will to change organizational practices and public policies. That's how you reshape social norms. And so we use that as a guide when we were working with men. We could get men to the table, we didn't have a problem having focus groups and having meetings and getting men to the table in Minnesota. What we had problems with is we didn't know what to do with them. Once they got to the table, now what do we do with them? So we used the spectrum of prevention. It's on Prevent Connect website in California, US. But it was basically the only reason we ever did any awareness building with men or education or connection with men was only to create that social capital and the political will to move to action, to change organizational practices and public policies that support sexist oppression, right? Racist oppression, all levels, heterosexist, all levels of oppression. So we have to move to action, and we have to raise our expectations of men's action. And this isn't guys riding in on horses, knights coming to save women. This is about men working in partnership with women, taking leadership from women, listening to women, like you were talking, Joey, right? Listening to them. It's incredible, really listening to them. And then making the change. And then the question again is, do we care? And will our compassion override our privilege? Because one of the first things we're going to hit with our compassion for change is we're going to run right into our benefits and our privileges. And am I willing to give those up? And so can we silently sit by as men, as women are marching all over the place, are trying to speak, the Me Too movement, trying to end this violence, and nothing's happening by the male system? Do we just sit quietly by and call ourselves good guys? Or go to a march once a year or twice a year and call ourselves good guys, have nice conversations with women, but we won't talk to our friends about it? Men have to speak to men. Mm-hmm. Men have a tendency to not listen to women. That's why I liked earlier that you were so informed by the women who knew that you would listen. Men need to talk to men in partnership with women, but we need to talk to our friends and say, this has got to stop, guys. And we can see our friends do things, and we can see them be quiet. They can tell stories. We can share our own stories, right? And say, has that ever happened to you? But our silence with other men is a part of the problem. And I remember being in, when I first started doing this, one of my aha moments, like you were talking about, Joey, was being in a class in a university. And I can't remember if I was in the class or if I was facilitating it, but the men and the women were separated. And they're separated into small groups, and they were asked, what concerns do you have about challenging men about their sexist behaviors, or whether it's language or action or whatever it is? And the men, so they talk in small group, the women would be in small groups talking, the men would be in small groups talking, and then they'd come back and we'd ask the men to report back first, and we'd write it up on a board. And the men would say, I'm afraid the other guys won't like me. And that was it. And this is multiple times this happened. They said, I'm afraid the other guys won't like me. And then the women would speak, and we'd fill the whole board with all the reasons why the women were afraid to confront men. I'm afraid they're going to follow me out to the parking lot and assault me, rape me, beat me. I'm afraid they're going to stalk me. I'm afraid they're going to harass me online. I'm afraid they're going to fire me. I'm afraid. And it just went on and on and on. And it was one of my aha moments. I went, oh, okay, I get it. Because I was nervous about talking to my friends too at that time. Mm-hmm. I said, oh, okay, now I get it. I'm afraid the other guys won't like me. And the women are afraid the other guys are going to beat them, rape them, stalk them, kill them. Okay, all right, now I get it. So totally, those moments moved me to action.
On I don't know if we might call it a closing note or something. You did mention in the beginning that no matter where you went, and even if you had to even resort to a translator, both the men and the women that you would be talking to would know what you're talking about, because it's very much a global thing. Can you talk a bit more about that? Maybe give some examples, and the reason why I'm asking this is, I know after this, again, when we're done with everything, I'm going to send this to a number of groups I'm in. I'll share it on social media, of course. I'll ask some friends to also share it on social media. Now, what I'll try to do is I will send it to individual friends, guy friends especially, and tell them, hey, this happened. I did this. They already know I'm having a podcast, of course. It would mean a lot for me and I think it will be very important for you as well, um, if you listen to this, and let me know what you think. We can have a chat about it, etc., etc. After that, one of the things I'm worried, if you want, that might happen is that some of my friends might think, or if, they may not say it to me, but they may think it, that, well, this guy is talking about Minnesota, he's talking about the American context, and this is what's happening over there. We're seeing now there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of issues with toxic masculinity, there's a lot of issues with cops being violent, etc., etc. What are some of the examples you can think of? And I hope I'm not just putting you on the spot, about some of the examples that you've had, that you've heard in sort of like all parts of the world.
Well, I think the best example, Joey,
Mm-hmm.
is the conversation you and I are having right now.
Mm-hmm.
You were raised in Lebanon?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I was raised in Minnesota. And I'm not having any trouble at all relating to what you're saying. Are you having any trouble relating to what I'm saying?
No, no, not at all.
Yeah, no, me neither. So I think this is an amazing example. Lebanon is quite a bit further away from me than Minnesota. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of on the other side of the world
Mm-hmm.
in many ways. I mean, I had the same experience in Taiwan. I went to Taiwan. I did a week presentation with the government down there training criminal justice people on how to respond to domestic violence cases. And I thought to myself, oh, this will be really interesting. Taiwan, that's on the other side of the world. It'll be really interesting. See how different it is there, how they're responding to domestic violence. God, that wasn't interesting at all. What was interesting is that they were responding exactly the same way they were in St. Cloud, Minnesota, in the US, in Taiwan, the same way. It was a family issue. It was none of their business. The men's the head of the household. We shouldn't be involved. And so the police were doing nothing about it. And the women in Taiwan were looking at the power and control wheel that was made by women in northern Minnesota and going, yep, that is exactly what he's doing to me. Right? So there's all kinds of examples how this is relevant. But I think, again, Joey, if you're going to share this with friends, I think it's amazing that, right, how much we're connected. And you were raised in Lebanon and I was raised in Minnesota. So this male cultural norm is global. The examples you're giving are excellent. The examples that you're giving about listening to your partners and to women, your friends, is excellent. The willingness of you even to acknowledge that I have all these benefits. I make a couple of easy dishes cooking and I get major support. Meanwhile, the sister who knows how to do this 3 times better than me gets grief.
Mm-hmm.
That's called male privilege.
Mm-hmm.
That reality is I will have to give some stuff up. And am I willing to do that? Or am I willing to stay silent and support all the violence, the murder, the abduction, the sexual objectification, the trafficking, everything that's happening to women and girls? Am I willing to sit by quietly so that I don't have to compete with them in the workplace, in the economy? Income inequality, it's absurd, global. You want to use a global example of patriarchy? Look at income inequality throughout the world in all cultures. And this will vary by cultures, but the inequality is massive throughout the globe. And again, it's a lot easier for me to control women if I want to, if I have the income and they don't.
Of course.
So I think it's quite easy, very easy, in fact, to identify this as a global issue. And it surprised me when I first experienced it internationally. But you're in a great position just from hearing how you're speaking to this and your understanding about this. Um, I just put this stuff to guys. And here's how I grew up, and here's how I behaved. Here's how it benefited me, and then I decided to change. But there's not a guy in a room for over 37 years who could ever deny the things I was saying about normal male cultural behavior that harms women and girls. None of them, because it was just normalized. It was just us having fun. Come on, we're just telling a little joke. I mean, this is the thing when men push back. This is also a good thing to be aware of. A lot of times, resistance of the privileged reveals the truth of the oppression. And in cases with men, when you challenge them about their jokes and their comments, they say, come on, or their behaviors at a party where they gang raped a woman. Come on, we were just having a little fun. Come on, it was just a joke. And we say, yes, that's true. Yes, it is fun. Men, it is fun to make jokes about women's bodies and what we like to do with them. It is fun to make sexist comments. It is fun to rape women. Men do it for fun. Then the question is that how you want to have fun? Do you want to support this society that 1 in 3 women and more have to worry about being raped and have been raped? You want to support this society where men think it's just fine to smack their wives if they're not doing what they want them to do? Because that's the question for men, is do we care? What kind of human beings do we want to be?
Well, on that difficult but important note, Chuck, really, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been very, very interesting for me. I'm hoping it will be very interesting and revealing and maybe changing and everything to the people listening, especially the guys listening. And yeah, keep on doing what you're doing, and thank you for your time.
That's great, Joey. It was great. And your stuff is great. So yeah, you have your voice is very powerful. So, I would just go out there and use it. I didn't have a clue when I first started doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a clue how to talk to guys either.
Mm-hmm.
But I just started to. Yeah, and I learned as I went.